I think it's good to sort of analyse why everybody's successful and why you shop at one thing and not another, and try to think, have I got enough of a difference that I'm going to create a clientele and keep a clientele and develop a new clientele? And if you can do something that's sort of visually interesting, which is obviously we're in a very visual world with, you know, TikToks and Instagrams and stuff like that, your customers will do the talking for you.
Hello and welcome to the Mentors Edition. I'm Michelle Chikanda and I'm delighted that you've decided to join me for another episode. Today I'm going to be talking to the founder of Pretty Ballerina Shoes, David Bell. I've got to talk about the shoes first. For those of you that know, I absolutely love shoes. And I do believe I've been asked so many times on the podcast, off the podcast, you know, about the importance of how you show up for work in terms of how we dress. And my biggest advice is almost always, you should wear things that allow you to be comfortable. What is more comfortable than a pair of ballerina shoes? So I'm thrilled to be talking to the genius, the man behind the creation of one of the most iconic ballerina shoes in the world. You know, when I walk past a shop, I know that's a pair of Pretty Ballerinas. You know, I might not get it right all the time, but they're so recognizable, they're so iconic. And today I'm going to be speaking to the man who came up with the idea and the machine that is the brain around how that sort of creation ultimately works. We're going to be talking about self-disruption. We're going to be talking about self-determination. We're going to be talking about what it takes to build a recognizable brand. And you can take all that information and apply it to either your career, or you can take it if you're thinking about starting or developing your side hustle and starting a business. He gives some phenomenal advice right before the podcast ends. So make sure you watch it right up to the end so that you can get his advice and so that you continue to grow and learn. I'm really excited about this podcast because what it does is it sort of de-superhumanizes. I don't think that's a word, but oftentimes when we see people that are successful, we make them superheroes and we create distance between what they are able to do and what we are able to do. And what David did in this podcast is he broke everything down such that it became simple enough for anybody that wants to go out and start a brand or develop their brand or even, you know, become the best version of themselves in their career, can take that advice and use it from the moment that they finish listening. So this is a really great podcast episode and I hope you enjoy it. David, thank you so much for joining me for the podcast. Delighted to have you on, and I can't wait.
Thank you for inviting me.
Dive into all the exciting stuff we spoke about before. So I'm going to just go straight into it. You grew up in England, and one of the things that struck me the most in our conversation was the influence that as a child your mother and your grandmother had on you. So just tell me a little bit about, you know, your childhood and what you learned, the basics, or, you know, the values that you learned when you were growing up.
Yeah, my parents were, in fact, it's my mum's birthday on Sunday, so I'm just off up to see them. They live in Nottingham, but they're from the north. They're from the kind of war. They were children during the war, and they had that kind of typical attitudes of, you know, being very careful with money, not showing off, sort of being grateful for everything you had, and you know, that they were, I would say, pretty permissive as parents, but they were very strict on how you ate and how you spoke. So kind of grammar and being kind of polite and respectful. Those were the sort of things that they were absolutely tough as old boots on, and pretty much anything else you could sort of wangle your way around.
Yeah. And just tell me about this idea of, you know, you coming up, you come from a humble home, you know, your parents, you know, are born at a time of, as you said, frugality and you know, being a good person really is the foundation of it. And so tell me about coming up. It sounds like you didn't have very much handed to you. What were your experiences like as you began to grow up and enter into the early working career?
Yeah. Well, my parents sort of didn't have they were kind of aspirational. So my grandparents grew up in a kind of terraced house on one side, and on another side, in England, you can judge somebody's class by exactly what house they live in.
Yeah.
So the grandparents on the other side grew up in a semi-detached, and the grandfather from the semi-detached wore a shirt and tie for work, but he wasn't a graduate. So they were what I'd call aspirational lower middle class.
Yeah.
And my parents achieved kind of a detached house, but then they didn't have a lot of money for extras. We had plenty to eat, and we were loved, and we had clothes. I got the mickey taken a lot at school because I grew like really quickly. I mean, I was considered tall back in the day. Now I'm not, but you had, when you've taken your school trousers up really, really high and then let them out 5 times, and there's the lines on the trousers. And I remember nagging my mum to death to get me, like the Adidas T-shirt with the 3 stripes and the matching. They still make exactly the same model today. I mean, it was £5 in like 1976, which was like
your age now.
Yeah. And also buying some Adidas. There was Sambas, Mambas, and Bambas, which were the kind of they now sell as the retro one. I tried to get a pair of what they called the skateboard shoes. I forget the brand. Vans, exactly. Vans were sort of the hottest thing. Never managed that one, but my kids now wear them. It's weird. So yeah, I grew up from that sort of poorer family. Not poor, but like, they didn't have money to throw around. Went to uni, and I went to Manchester, which had a big old mix of people. You had all sorts of income levels. And one thing that illustrated, there was this guy called Charlie that lived in the flat I was in. And he spoke with a sort of posh accent, but you didn't sort of think about it much. He never had any money at all and was always stealing everybody's food. And then he broke his leg, and a chauffeur-driven Rolls Royce came to pick him up. And you sort of thought, I think that guy's was slightly different back. And then you sort of started to notice the kind of...
We're different kinds of broke.
Yeah. And there were sort of different tribes at uni, and you could see that, there were people who were really from what I'd call a very kind of poor family, and very wealthy, and sort of everything in between. But I think I always had a kind of slightly aspirational desire to sort of have nice things more than anything. If you've tried on a cashmere coat,
oh yeah,
I mean, it's twice the warmth for the same thickness. You scrunch it up, it doesn't wrinkle. It lasts forever. It's like wearing a bed blanket. Well, I mean, there's a reason these things were so valued. I started to, as my mum would always say, who's like Northern, has absolutely zero diplomacy, and she'd always say, "You've got a Rolls Royce ideas on a push bike income."
Yeah, but and that's the thing, and there's nothing wrong with that because it allowed you to, explore and dream, right?
Yeah. And just to go back to a point you made earlier that I didn't fully answer. So I grew up in a household where my dad, I mean, it's not that he never speaks, but he will never compete to talk. So he's quiet, he's quite shy, he's quite a sort of deep thinker. And my mum's very, very talkative, which I've obviously got from her. So, and my grandmother lived with us all my childhood from 6 years old, because she was like the least healthy 55-year-old in the world, and was destined to live 3 or 4 years, and lived till she was 93. all 4'11" of her. She was like tough as old boots. So I had a sort of very female dominated kind of
upbringing.
So I do that thing where if there's a sort of, well, older lady, there's not so many ladies so much older than me now because I'm not so young, but I'd always sort of notice older ladies had their hair done and kind of compliment them on it, saying, "Oh, your hair looks nice." And that sort of lady who was your grandma's age would appreciate that kind of comment. Perhaps now people don't like comments, but back in the day, I think, phrased correctly, it was kind of made people happy that somebody noticed a small detail.
Yeah. And so you grow up, you have these two strong women in the house, and naturally you start to notice some of the things about women. So it's not so surprising that there were some things that that led you to where you ended up in a way.
Yeah.
So it kind of all began somewhere, but it didn't always have, it wasn't always so glamorous. One story you told me, which I found fascinating, was the story about the meat factory. That glamorous job.
So I worked in my holidays. I worked for Northern Foods, which makes most of the kind of or made, I'm not sure if it still does, most of the kind of pork pies, sausage rolls, things like that for the big supermarkets. They have one factory that deals with most of the supermarkets, and then, for example, back in the day, Marks and Spencer's had its very own factory with kind of slightly different conditions, but and I was a massive defender of that kind of product. I never ate pork pies till I worked in the factory, and I started liking them afterwards. And it's one of my favourite foods. It's kind of weird, but one day I got sort of as a prank, I got locked in a sort of bone skip where they put all the kind of bits and bobs and full of flies and whatever. It wasn't brilliant, but I had that. I was delighted to have any kind of job that would pay me some money. And I'd wake. I mean, this sounds like a proper. It sounds like Monty Python. You got to lick gravel off road luxury, but I'd literally wake up at 4:30, 6 days a week, and cycle 10 miles to work, 9 hours and sometimes 12, and then cycle back. But I got paid. I remember I got paid like £129 take home pay in 1986. I mean, that was like. I mean, that bought you a lot of beers.
Yeah, but what I really love about that idea is it's kind of like no job is too small. Like, it's whatever I need to do, I'm open to doing it. And you did wake up every day so early in the morning and cycle because of this mindset that, okay, this is what I need. And at that time, it was money for beers. This is what I've got to do to get it. And it was like that simple.
And that was something, another thing my parents very much sort of, I got from them was your word is your bond. You might not have much, but if you said you're going to do it, obviously, you break your leg, maybe you're not going to, but if it's at all within your grasp, you should absolutely do it. And, my brother's just the same. He's a senior editor at Bauer Media, who do a lot of like publishing things. And he's, if I, my mum, my dad, or my brother say they're going to do something, I would bet my life it's done, because they don't, they might not agree to it because they say they can't do it, but once they've committed, heaven and earth will not, wild teams of wild horses will not stop them doing it. And I think that's worth something. People who are kind of flaky, I can't bear, because you can't rely on them. Not that I can't bear them, but if somebody is sort of consistently flaky, I don't necessarily plan with them being there. If they're there and they're fun, it's an extra, but I don't want to give a job to somebody then I have to sort of be worried that they're not going to do it.
I agree. And I think sometimes that's where things go wrong, because people often give lip service to a lot of things and then don't deliver. And that actually fractures relationships. It's not always in a big way, but oftentimes it's even in a little way, because now you're thinking, I have this job that I want done. I'm going to give it to somebody who's less capable, but that I'm sure is going to do it.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, there was a thing I watched on one of these Instagram Reels things, saying in the Navy SEALs, which is one of the highest performing organizations in the world, the thing they put highest above everything is trust and dependability, even above talent, because you need to rely on people and somebody with that sort of grit and gumption that will dig deep to get something done. That's vitally important.
No, I completely agree. So let's circle back a little bit to now talk about, you've graduated, you've done your time in the meat factory, you go out into the big wide world of corporate. What was that experience like as you begin to start thinking, okay, what do I want to do? How did you go about getting your first job? What was the thinking? Fresh out of uni, then what happens?
Briefly, I sold jewelry, which was through a sort of friend of mine who sold jewelry at like market stalls and in hospitals and things like that. Dabbled with that for a little bit, but my kind of overdraft just seemed to be sort of getting bigger, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to. I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't even know myself. I think you know yourself better when you're older. To a certain extent, there's that sort of. It's probably more of a male arrogance thing of thinking, well, I could do that. When probably most things I'd be absolutely shocking at. But, as a young man full of testosterone, you're kind of like, oh, yeah, Prime Minister, I could do that, ship it
in. I can do that part-time and then run another country the other half of the time.
Because I think your excess testosterone in some ways is a good thing that gives you kind of, in some ways, belief in yourself, but it also makes you blind to kind of details. But so I didn't know what I wanted to do, and eventually I sort of thought, I've got to bite the bullet and pay my overdraft off and do something. And I thought the quickest way to do it, and I remembered something my father had said. He and the rest of my family worked for pharmaceutical companies. He said, you could be a sales rep for a drug company. And I applied for a few jobs, and I got one with a company called Ledderly Laboratories, which now doesn't exist. It was one of those that got swallowed up by, all the companies bought. And I got, and they were recruiting nationally, and I got this job in Peterborough, which I'd never even heard of, as my brother, who bizarrely ended up living there as well. We used to call it Peter Bog Horror, which was probably somewhat unkind because it does have a lovely sort of cathedral and it's very green, and it's built on a kind of like a American system where you have dual carriageways everywhere and lots of out of town shopping. I mean, it was very practical, but that was my first sort of job, visiting GP surgeries principally, and
just to clarify, this job didn't come from you. It came from looking around you and thinking, okay, I've got lots of family in this industry or whatever, and then somebody else giving you a nudge to say, hey, why don't you?
I think it was something my dad had suggested years before. I'd never really considered, and I had a biology degree, which was a necessary qualification for this job, and I thought, I'll apply. I don't know if I'll get any interviews. The economy was just sort of cooling then because it was late '89 and it was already sort of wobbling slightly. And I thought, maybe now is time to get onto a sort of, get into something. And so I applied for all these jobs, and they said, obviously to be a medical rep, you had to drive around and see people. And they said, have you got a driving license? And I, of course, said yes. I didn't even have a provisional. And I just thought, I'm sure that can't be so hard. And I got like a first interview, and I thought, well, I had a sort of weird, I was sort of shy and noisy at the same time. Weird, crappy combination. And I sort of didn't have a lot of self-belief in some ways, even though socially I did. And but I thought, I'll apply for this. Got the first interview, and then I got a second interview. Oh God, I might actually get this job. I get this job, I'm going to need to drive. So I applied for a provisional driving license quickly, and they basically offered me the job, and I had 4 weeks to get a driving license, and so I basically booked. I rang up 20 driving schools and said, who can give me lots of lessons. And British School of Motoring, who has hundreds of drivers, they said, we can give you as many as you like. So I had 26 hours lessons, between in 4 weeks, took the test and passed it.
That's amazing. You're lucky. I shouldn't say this on the recorded, but it took me 3 times. I didn't manage until the 4th time I got it.
Yeah, I mean, it was lucky. I mean, I didn't have any natural aptitude. Just it was an easy day. And the funny thing was, it was like to get the test so quickly that there was a 13-week waiting list. I had to apply for an emergency cancellation. So I got one in Prestwich, which is a very kind of Orthodox Jewish area of North Manchester. So there was literally an area full of people who are sort of, in the Orthodox way. So like rabbis are dressed with a kind of black full black clothing, and it was an area I'd never been to. It was, I think, because I was kind of really nervous, I was paying really, really close attention to everything, and luckily didn't make any mistakes. But anyway,
Yeah.
so
But again, this highlights this mindset of, okay, I need to get this done in order for me to get what I want.
sure.
You're quite dogged. You're like, okay, most people would have said, oh, I need a license. I don't have a license. I'm going to try something else. You were like, don't have a license? Well, we'll build that plane while we're flying.
License schmeisens.
Exactly. So we move on. You get into this career in the pharmaceutical world, and then you end up in London because you started out in Peterborough and then you moved on. Just talk me through the transition, where you start to develop this career. Now you've got the job, you're starting to get your wits about, you're starting to know what's going on. And then what happens that triggers a move?
Well, I stayed in. I had a move in the middle. I went back up to Manchester
because I did. Yeah.
Which was Peterborough was very quiet, and I sort of went back up and lived a sort of party lifestyle for some years. And then a friend of mine I'd made up there, he went back to London to his first job, which was for a publishing company. Which is, if you ever watch Have I Got News for You, all those things like magazines like Tunnels and Tunneling, Pig Breeders Weekly. He worked for the company that made all of those, and they offered me a job in the north initially. And I was sort of tired of the pharmaceutical industry because it was becoming very corporate, and I was slightly more kind of wild card, which was a kind of type of personality that was appreciated when I started, but was becoming less appreciated. It was becoming more, we do it this way. By this time, I was working for Pfizer, which was becoming the world's #1 company, and they wanted to sort of, they were, they're an amazing company, but they wanted people who were a bit more corporate, and I didn't feel like I fitted into that. And it was no problem of theirs, but you start to feel you're a sort of square peg in a round hole. And I was offered this job in publishing, trade publishing, and decided to take it. The same friend who recommended me for the first job, there was an internal promotion possible down south working in London, but he recommended me again. And so that was the job I took that got me in London.
Interesting. So you were like, okay, that's where the opportunity is. That's where I'm going. There was no overthinking, or, it was just opportunity arises. That's where I need to be.
And I think also the way I plan things, I've got a sort of scientific mind. I come from a long line of scientists, so I write down every decision, the pros and cons, the advantages, disadvantages, weight them of likely outcomes, worst case scenario, and then I just do completely what I fancy. I feel better for having gone through all the process.
Do you know what? Somebody, I can't remember where I read this. Somebody said their decision-making matrix is flip a coin, which is already quite sophisticated. And then if you see the result and your heart is like, oh, then you do the other thing.
Yeah. Another way I have a look at it is if you're sort of lying in bed at night and you're sort of just before you go to sleep, you have that worry of, you've been offered something. What if I don't do it? What if I lose it? That's the thing to do, because that's the thing that really is exciting you on a deep level. And, in my opinion, there's a famous phrase by I can't remember if it was Oscar Wilde saying people who know what job they want to do will the ones who get it, that will be their punishment.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So now you're in London, you're living your best life professionally. Talk me through what happens next. I know that you're a big believer in sliding doors, and it's a really great film. And me and my friends always talk about having a sliding doors moment. For those people that haven't watched Sliding Doors, watch it. It's a great movie. But yeah, you're a great believer in sliding doors. So you're in London. You're living your best corporate life, and then what happens?
Yeah. So I with this relatively new job I'd started, being the kind of sales and marketing manager of this kind of tiny little division of magazines. which was like, it was all about leather making and footwear making and stuff like that. It was quite sort of technical, really, really dry, but it was a great job. You got to sort of travel a lot, meet people all around the world. One of the biggest trade fairs in that business was in Bologna, twice a year, called Linea Pelle. And I had a sort of secretary that, for some reason, it was my job to book the hotels for this trade fair. And we'd had many conversations about traveling and the hotel, but I'd assumed it was booked. I mean, because everybody else was there, and we hadn't got a hotel room. So we had to scramble at literally like 3 days before. And this fair was like 29 halls. It was like massive. It was so busy and impossible to get a hotel room. But we ended up in this kind of half-built hotel where the cleaners would sort of come in your room while you were in a towel, and that happened to me, and not leave, and be sort of cleaning around you. So you're there absolutely naked, other than a towel. And there's these sort of cleaners sort of cleaning around you, and all that one key fit every key for every other room. So I mean, just stuff. So we ended up there. I mean, the hotel was fine. It was just not quite sort of finished. And I ended up meeting my future wife and ex-wife on that trip, because her father was a sort of Don Corleone kind of very sort of stern Spanish businessman, very, very impressive guy. I mean, incredible. But he had a very sort of dour manner, very black beard. He looked like the Anthill Mob, if you remember that cartoon years ago. And he'd been going to the same hotel every year for 30 years. The Italians who owned the hotel had asked for prepaid rooms, and he'd sort of said, "This is not for me. I've been coming here 30 years. I am, their best customer." And he didn't book the hotel either. So they ended up literally arriving with no hotel. They ended up in the same hotel. And the first day of the fair, they put on a bus, and I got on sort of last. And there's this girl who I found very attractive. She was sat right at the end. There was a space next to her, and next to her was the ferocious father. I was thinking, oh no, this is kind of nice because she's attractive, and really scary because I'm going to wake up with a horse's head in my bed or something. Anyway, I sat between them, in fact, and I was sort of trying to think, of a way to kind of get talking. And I had this suit on, a new suit with the like one of those sort of chalk stripe, diplomatic stripe ones, and the pockets were lightly sewn. And I unpicked the pockets, thinking this will create conversation. And she said, "Oh, what are you doing?" She spoke English, and that was that. Really ended up, seeing each other, dating, ended up getting married, having hundreds of children, or well, only three, but sometimes seems like there's more.
Yeah, sounds like you got a taste of your own medicine.
Yeah.
No, but I love that. I think it's so funny. You're thinking, gorgeous woman, can't quite chat her up in front of her scary father. So you're like, I'm going to do something to make her chat to me.
Yeah. And the funny thing was, I was a secret for the first year and a half from the family, because she'd had lots of disastrous boyfriends, and they said, "We don't want to know anybody." And I said to her, "We should let them know, because it's insulting to your parents." And she said, "Oh, they won't remember you." I said, "Of course they'll remember me. I'm, some guy." Anyway, I was finally introduced a year and a half later at a co-worker's wedding, and he shook my hand and said, "I think I've seen you on a bus somewhere." Anyway, sorry, I digress.
Yeah, anyways, that's so funny. The guy that he met on the bus somewhere. Yeah. That is quite the intro. How do you follow up from that? Anyway, so you're now with your wife, and you are still in London. How do you then transition? Yeah. How was Pretty Ballerina born?
Well, I started. We got married. She had a lot of flexibility because she was, the daughter of the owner, effectively, and her job could be done a lot remotely. And we decided after a year they needed a UK agent. I had a sort of commercial background. If I was going to live in Menorca, which is a tiny place, I needed something where I'd have regular access to the UK, the family and friends and whatever. So decided to be like the UK agent for the company and work in the kind of head office when I wasn't. And I'd go to trade fairs, I'd go on trips, go to see customers, and I always had a sort of marketing type view because I'd always found adverts very interesting, a little bit of psychology, how people think, and also I'm kind of good, I think, at having a kind of overview of things. Like I'm not a detailed person, which I have to force myself to be doing, but I think I see sort of blur my eyes and see a bit the bigger picture better.
The bigger picture.
Because I'm not good at the detail, I sort of, detail scary, it was talked about in the company of possibly doing a website. The company I worked for was called Mascaro, which was made all sorts of shoes, but its history was it had started making ballet dance shoes. My scary father-in-law had the idea of putting a street sole on a ballet slipper to make it like a casual street shoe, and then he'd started putting heels on it, and it evolved into a whole collection. And this company had been around at the time. I created the brand in 2004. It had been around making ballerinas, and also since 1918, 87 years. Also, when the company started to expand abroad with what is now my ex-sister-in-law, who was the commercial manager, she'd gone to Singapore and Hong Kong, places like that, and the first thing that sold was ballerinas. So ballet shoes had a sort of big importance in the company. But the branding was very sort of masculine. The colors were sort of dark gray, green, and it was all quite sort of solid and we are shoemakers kind of thing. And I thought that was one sort of factor. Another factor was when you tried to sell interesting designs, the retailer would say, oh no, it's too risky, my customers won't buy that, I want black, beige, navy blue. That was a filter. And there were all these sort of things swirling around. And I thought, you know what? The biggest problem you have with an online shop is returns. At the time, internet sales of fashion products was fledgling, but you had years of research in catalog shopping, which was very big in Germany. And the average return rate for footwear was 44%. And that's ruinaceous. And I thought, why don't I? There's one more factor. Ballerinas had come back in trend since 2002 and 2004. Mascaro, who were like experts making this footwear for 87 years, really hadn't noticed any sort of sales bump. And there were all these people, all these brands that were really sort of created brands, like what I call marketing brands. There's nothing behind it. It's just somebody's had an idea. They don't make it. They don't really design it. They put their label in and do some catalogs and stuff like that. These guys were all making hay, and I was thinking that's not sort of fair. And so sort of thoughts came to my head, and I thought, if we did a ballerina only brand, first you've got round the fitting problem because the shapes never change basically. So once you've bought your first pair and got the size right, you know that any time you try that shape, whatever design is on it, it's always going to fit you the same because the internal volume is the same. So I gave each shape, each last, a female screen icon's name from the 1960s, which was when the ballerinas were last a big deal. So there was Audrey for Audrey Hepburn, there was Brigitte for Brigitte Bardot, there was various others. As time went on, I started adding other names of people I like. So there was Shirley for Shirley Bassey. There was, whatever. And I thought, also, if you can go to the final consumer direct, you can sell them more bonkers things, and it's the bonkers things that make you a brand and make you noticed and people talk about and fall in love with and get excited about. So I thought, if we do a website direct to consumer, we don't even try and sell it wholesale, we don't even try and put it anywhere else. And it was, again, this was one one of those sort of slightly dodgy stories. It was hell. I always believe a lot in luck and timing. You've got to work hard, but you can also be lucky, and the timing can be favourable. So, at the time, the Spanish government, I was launching Pretty Ballerinas. They were offering a subsidised PR company in 5 countries, and we were already in the program with Mascaro, and people had asked for good images, and I thought, you know what I'm going to do? I'll photograph in high resolution every single shoe in the collection and put it on what used to before a pen drive, you'd have a CD, or a cloud, you'd have a CD. And what often happened for a small brand was you'd get the magazine like Vogue would call you Friday afternoon and say, we want to feature your product. And they say, when do you want it? And they'd say, now. And say, we haven't got it now. We're in this tiny island miles away.
Yeah.
So what I decided to do was create a library of pictures as a resource, because the way the magazines worked was they had 4 or 5 amazing pieces from mega designer brands, like a red dress from Valentino, a watch from what's he called, Muller. You'd have a jewelry piece from Tiffany's or something like that.
Yeah.
And to make up the trend, they'd probably want 4 or 5 other products that the editor wasn't so bothered about what was in it,
just to fill the space.
Yeah. So we gave them, I did one of every color, did it on a CD and sent it to them. And the idea was that they'd have it as a resource. They'd print ours instead of somebody else's and just make it easy for them to use ours. So I ended up having to buy a machine that copied CDs 7 at a time and do like 3,000 CDs that took me, 2 weeks every night till 10 o'clock at night. But to get them to the editors, I did something a little bit sneaky, which was I prepared these information packs for the Mascaro program that was to the PR companies. And what I did was I slipped in the Pretty Ballerina CD and printed a nice branding thing on a paper on the CD to sort of, and put did a little catalogue, put that on a PDF in the CD, and the brand story. And I just put it in and didn't tell anybody. And then the next time we had a meeting, there was like 15 brands in the program. The top brand was Pretty Ballerinas, which wasn't even in the program, in all 5. And they were like, that was a bit tricky.
Well, that's brilliant, right? It's this idea that, you've got an idea and you're like, I can see why this is going to work. Here are the trends that are leading to it. I don't have all the details, don't need all the details. You're like big picture thinking. And then you're like, what do I need to do to get this done? And then you're like, whatever it is, that's what I need to do. Now, I have 2 questions for you. One is before and one is after. So you've moved to a new country. You kind of glossed over this a little bit. You've moved to a new country and you're now working in the sector. You're working in shoes for a bigger company with no knowledge of shoes, and you're working with your in-laws.
who we had lunch with every day.
Who you had lunch with every day.
And I'd also learned a bit of Spanish.
You just speak the language. This is just getting better and better.
No, but it wasn't even, I learned, I did 20 lessons of Spanish. And they don't speak Spanish, they speak Catalan. So I was going there thinking, what the hell's this?
And they are, even though you would think that they are similar. And to those that know both languages, they are similar. But if you don't know both languages, they're
it's as similar as Italian and Spanish or French and Spanish. It's
if you know the languages, they're similar.
Yeah. But it was very stressful. My brain used to be like completely fuzzy by the end of the day because I'd be hearing a mixture of I'd be trying to speak Spanish. They'd answer me in Spanish, and between them, they'd speak Catalan. And so I had a new country, a new wife who'd just got pregnant 2 weeks before I moved over there.
Lovely.
So I was new to living with her, new to having, a pregnant wife, new country, new language, new sector, new job, new house, new car, new.
and no support that you're used to, right? There's no mates to go down to the pub with, your family's not there. So just talk me through that. You're experiencing a lot of change. Is there no part of you that feels overwhelmed and wants to or wants to quit? I mean, how was that for you emotionally?
Yeah, it was quite tough. I was sort of tired every day, but you get through it, and it was fine.
Yeah, but what's the mindset? How do you get through it?
Well, sometimes you have a sort of bad day, but I believe very much. A friend of mine, in fact, the friend who told me about the job initially, he said, if you're ever not feeling great, have a sleep. Have a sleep, you'll wake up renewed. And I always drink water and have a sleep. That those two things really make a difference to me.
Yeah. And it sounds basic, but it's tomorrow's a new day. I will face whatever I need to face. I just need to sleep and have some water.
Yeah, sure.
I love that. And then there's the second question, which is the after. So, you've been working for this big brand, big company, and now you're like, okay, I'm going to step out on my own and create something unique, having learned a lot about shoes and all of this. And now I'm grinding, doing what I need to do, making decisions that are advantageous, sometimes disadvantageous, working hard, doing all this stuff. Did you not think, what if it doesn't work?
No, because I thoroughly believed it wasn't going to work.
Okay.
Because new projects that work, there aren't so many. It's much more likely that things don't work. But I also have a sort of mental thing for myself, which is if I've done everything I possibly could to make it work and it doesn't work, I just think it wasn't meant to be, But I don't want to leave a single doubt in my own mind that I've not tried absolutely everything and pushed everything to the max to try. And then if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And, I've done lots of projects where theoretically it should have worked and it didn't. And this one, I didn't think it would work and it really worked well.
It worked extremely well. But I mean, let's talk about this dynamic because I think we have this expectation when people will hear, oh yeah, he founded Pretty Ballerinas, it's this great shoe brand and everything's all sunshine and roses. But what we don't talk about as much is this idea of your relationship with failure. You said, I've done things that have worked and I've done things that haven't worked.
Yeah.
When Pretty Ballerina worked, what about when you have done things that haven't worked? What is your relationship with failure?
I probably don't give things as long as other people. I don't know if that's right or not right. I would probably tend to, believe that things largely work fairly quickly if they're going to work. And if they don't, try something else. There's people who've, tried much longer and harder than I have on something, and it has eventually worked, but that's just me. I think that you're sort of aligned with the times or you're not, and I have great admiration for these people who've grummaged away for 15 years on something and eventually it's worked. Like Caravaggio, one of the painters, he painted for 40 years and was rubbish till he was about 55, they said. I would have given up 54 and a half years before, because I don't have that level of, insane belief in something. Maybe if I did, if it was something I really, really, really truly believed in. I think a fashion brand's always difficult because it's down to taste.
Yeah.
And, if it was something that was more, you were doing nuclear fusion, you knew that if you could find cold nuclear fusion at an economic price, it will work commercially because that's like a holy grail. And I think something like a fashion brand, trying it, if it's going to work, it's going to start to gain some sort of traction. And if it doesn't, you could modify it or try something else, I believe.
Yeah, but I like that because you're kind of, what you're saying is fail fast, but fail forward. It's kind of like, it's kind of try what you need to try and do it. And if it fails, you move on to the next thing quickly. Don't lose momentum. I think you actually reminded me of the quote, Churchill's quote, no? the last
Yeah,
time we spoke.
yeah,
Yeah.
he said the secret of success in life is to stumble from one disaster to the next without losing
Losing
enthusiasm.
enthusiasm. But I think that's so true of life, because not everything that you are going to do is going to be successful. But the
Yeah,
mindset is, I must keep failing forward.
yeah. And I
So
think a lot of people have done this. I think the worst thing is when things work just enough to not be a failure, but they don't work well enough to be a success. But you've still got, a lot of people who started blogs and stuff. It's tricky because if it doesn't sort of start to gain traction, you're still left with having to produce the content, and um, it's it's hard to keep going.
yeah, but I also want to talk about something else. You've never worked in, this is my final question before I ask you for the advice piece, but you've talked a lot about, moving from pharmaceuticals, and you moved from pharmaceuticals, then you went into publishing, then from publishing you went into shoes. And it's kind of this idea of self-disruption. Oh yeah, and of course you were in meat before you were in all of this.
Well, that's holiday job, but yeah. And I also worked in every single supermarket stacking shelves as well. And
That's it. But I want to talk about this idea of change, and this idea of self-disruption. You probably until, you found your passion, which I will ask you about after the shoe bug. Um, you didn't have a limitation of, I work in pharmaceuticals, therefore that is me, or I work in publishing, therefore I cannot do anything else. You were quite happy to make that transition. And can you talk us through your ability to what allows you to be able to change with such ease, if you like?
Honestly, I think when I've always found it sort of exciting, a kind of wild card offer that you hadn't even considered. I even went to university like that. I applied for pharmacology, and I got, what they do at Manchester is, if you're not very bright or not bright enough to get in the course, they gave me what's called a changed course offer. Mm-hmm. And my first choice was Leeds. And at Manchester, they offered me a different course, and I went, and the people seemed sort of more fun somehow. And I just thought, it's destiny somehow, even though I'm theoretically scientific. Obviously, it's just that, also, when you've been in something for many years, and I've done, been worked for companies for quite a lot of years. There's all sorts of day-to-day niggly kind of boring detail that you're not very excited about, and then I've always found, being offered something completely out of the blue in something completely different. I think I'm not a mega bright person. I'm an averagely intelligent person, but I can work it out. And you speak to 20 customers and you already know half what there is to know. And you speak to 50 customers and 80% of what there is to know. And it's asking questions. It's being interested and having a passion and trying to make things better. And I think there's always that, it's hard and stressful and whatever, the early part of the learning curve and whatever, but it's also sort of great fun and it stimulates you. And then you reach a sort of plateau point where you're sort of going through the same again, and that's not as much fun. And I always say, I'm a hunter rather than a farmer. And, that opportunity of doing, tomorrow I want you to go to, go and live in Canada and manage a log cutting company. I mean, it would be exciting. It's like throwing everything up in the air. It all falls down somewhere else. And even though I'm very conservative and come from a sort of conservative family, there's that. Oh, this is nice. Why don't we try this?
So it's like life is a little bit of an adventure. You're like, I'm going to, I have my way. I can be scientific. I can be conservative, but why not?
Yeah, and I just think something new and different, and that you've never thought of doing. I mean, it's a bit like, when people plan their own house. I would never do it because you're limited by your own imagination, and you go looking around at houses and you find one you love with stuff that, from my criteria of, I want 5 bedrooms and I want a garage and I want blah blah blah, and then you find this tiny place that you couldn't swing a cat in, but you love it because it's so cute. That's the one you buy, and I'm like that, And I just think it's the same with jobs and opportunities and businesses, that
You
if
shouldn't
you
be
thought,
limited by your own imagination. I love that phrase.
yeah. So if I thought, what would I do in another job? Well, I'd look for a fashion, something in footwear, doing, and then it's sort of more of the same. Whereas if suddenly, you had a friend who wanted to start a cosmetic brand and they'd got Kyle Jenner to wear it or something, and they were getting lots of press, and you need to. I mean, that would be exciting. And I know nothing about cosmetics, but I don't need to be an expert on cosmetics. I need to know enough to talk the talk and understand what the customer wants. It's all about whatever I've done ever and whatever I would always do. I always try to think like the customer. I'm a customer, and you know, what motivates me to buy this? What would motivate a customer to buy this? Why are they buying what they're buying? And often it's not so logical. We buy stuff. We buy stuff on emotions. How is it that there's 9 billion brands of cosmetics when all it, there's nothing truly innovative in cosmetics, really, because everybody uses the same stuff. But people manage to create a brand and a feeling of what you aspire to. Why would you buy a Bentley when effectively it's an Audi? I mean, they sell you a Bentley because you're paying double because the seats are stitched nicer. But if I had the money, I'd buy a Bentley because I.
David.
Hey?
Be careful what you say. We don't want you getting sued.
Yeah, but the base of the car is the same, and everybody knows that. Like a Seat Leon is a Volkswagen Golf, which is an Audi A3. And I'm not criticizing it. It's just we buy things for reasons other than practical product reasons, and I do it exactly myself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I completely agree. But what I love about what you just said is having this curiosity. And it's like, okay, whatever environment I go into, I know that I can always ask the right questions.
Yeah, and it's not, business is not rocket science. Most of it is just common sense, asking questions. Pretty ballerinas, we've got a full footbed memory foam. I went to Asia thinking, I had a sort of, in footwear, you have sort of May and November sort of quiet. So you're between collections, you've sold one, you've not received it in retail yet. And you've got like a little, so tend to sort of do a trip and see some customers or some franchisees. And I speak to the local partner, the store managers, the marketing team, the individual sales assistants, and the customers in the shop. I speak to everybody because I'm just like there, as you know, we got talking in an airport queue. But just I'm interested in people's opinion. And every single person said the shoes are hard, like hard on the foot. And I was like, what? We've been making these shoes for, at the time, it was nearly 100 years, like 96 years or something. And they said, no, it's hard on the foot. And everybody said it to me, every single person. I was like, how could this be? We've sold millions of these shoes, literally. And I got back and I was like, we've got to make this right for the Asian market, that they're not saying this. I felt, we need to. And everybody's like, wow, we've never heard that. But anyway, if we make it more comfortable for the Asian market, everybody else, it's not bad for them either. No. And then all the customers in Europe and the United States were like, wow, these are so much more comfortable. Why didn't you say anything? But it wasn't like
nobody asked.
But I think it's in Asia, there's a lot of walking in shopping centres that the floor is very hard, and maybe you noticed it more. But I'd honestly never heard it once in years and years and years. But it's being, I think, one thing I admire in Italy and in Japan, particular countries, I noticed this, that the kind of pursuit of excellence, but not as a sort of bullshit strap line that people sort of bandy about. Italian food, even a simple plate, they'll always be trying to make it better. And in Japan, lots of businesses, they're always trying to make it better. They're never. Huh?
Kaizen, that's the Japanese principle of continuous improvement.
Yeah. And I think you should always do that with everything, because whatever's good today, maybe not, maybe it won't be so good tomorrow, and expectations change and technology changes. You can do things you couldn't do before.
Absolutely. And this is something that I like to try and live by. I don't want to be the best. I just want to be better than I was yesterday. It sounds so cliche, but actually it makes my life so much better.
Yeah, but it's the gym, isn't it? I mean, I was useless at sport at school. There was, thank God for the fat twins. There was these two lads who were sort of chubby in my class because when they pick football teams, they pick, each captain picks one. I was the last one before the fat twins because, and who are both really skinny now, bizarrely. That's
Yeah.
random. But I was just, like all, two left legs and two right arms. I was just useless. So me doing any sort of sporty thing, I was never going to be any good. But if I do something like running or weights or something, which you don't have to have lots of technique, you can measure progress,
Yeah.
and that's why I end up sort of doing, if I do anything sporty, running, weights, or swimming, because you're fighting, you're competing against yourself, and the idea is to be the best version of yourself. Because I'm never going to be Usain Bolt,
Yeah.
with my little knobbly knees and kind of bad coordination, or Michael Phelps with my when I swim. I mean, I can swim ages breaststroke, but if I do front crawl, it looks like the water is boiling. And my girlfriend, who's like, she practiced a lot of swimming. She almost doesn't leave a ripple. She cuts the water like a knife, and then I get it like.
I love that. I love that. No, but it is true. Continuous improvement is everything. Um,
Yeah.
and so just the final question that I have for you is there will be people that are listening that are thinking, okay, but I'm somewhere in my career at the beginning, in the middle, trying to start a new business towards the end, whatever it is. What advice do you think is the most important advice that either somebody's ever given you or something that you live by in terms of achieving whatever your idea of success is as a person?
Advice. I think don't listen to too much to other people, because people will always neg you out, as a friend of mine used to say. They'll always think of a reason why it's not going to work, and you can always think of reasons why things aren't going to work. You should think of reasons why it should work. Obviously, you've got to be realistic, but use your own criteria. Just think. One thing I go on about endlessly is this thing of what I call the blink effect of people have got no time these days. It's all social media, short clips. Nobody reads a book. Well, not nobody reads a book, people do, but people are have more attention deficit. You need to think of something that is kind of immediately understandable without spending a fortune trying to promote it. So if there's a brand I love the branding they've done called Colourful Standard,
Mm-hmm.
and they do jumpers, t-shirts, and trousers in millions of colors, and they have this sort of simple store concept, which is like grey polished cement, and they have these stands in pastel colors with hundreds of colors of jumpers, and you spot one of their stores and you can see it a mile away. It's so visually easy to understand what they do. And I think that's very clever. And this is selling jumpers and t-shirts. Who thought
Yeah.
there was a new way of doing that? I mean, that's clever. That's really clever. And also they pitch it. Another thing is pricing is very important. They pitch the jumpers at 89. So 89, that there's obviously you can find cheaper. You can go to Uniqlo and get something for 29 or 39. But to be sort of a bit desirable and under the 100,
Yeah.
it's a market. Yeah, lots of people. Yes, exactly, a sweet spot. So you need, obviously, there's sort of a pyramid of there's not so much of the mega luxury. There's lots of the cheap, and a decent chunk of the middle and upper middle. But if you can pick something popular that's going to appeal to lots of people, that's good. And another thing I'd say is, and I've read a very good book recently called The Cold Start Problem, which is about all this sort of network effects that they talk about. So you think, why is it that Airbnb or Uber's got 20,000 people working for them when you launch an app and suddenly everybody uses it? And it actually doesn't happen like that at all. When you read the book, it says they each network there's a hard side and an easy side. In Airbnb, it was the people leaving their homes, and in Uber, it's the drivers. And you need to kind of work out what it says in this book. What you need to do is dominate your niche. It's much better to find a tiny niche. And I found it sort of partly by accident also in the flat shoes, in magazines, which were very important, still important, but not perhaps quite as important now. The big brands didn't fight for the flat shoes. They fought for the high heel, which was their image, more than actually sales. So these mega brands, they sell more cosmetics and sunglasses and stuff like that. The footwear is probably not so important, but because it's image important, they had to have their shoes in, and they've got more leverage to get in than smaller brands. But flat footwear, nobody was fighting for, so it was easier to get coverage. I think you need to find a niche you can effectively dominate. That could be geographically, it could be a sub-segment of a segment. You need to offer something different, because or package differently. When you see, Gale's Bakery is on every corner, and what do? They bake bread and sell coffee. They do it well, but they've done it in a certain way that's slightly different, in the way that Starbucks did coffee.
Absolutely. You feel important when you go into Gale's, don't you?
Yeah.
In a way you don't when you go into Pret or Starbucks. There's nothing wrong with that. They serve a different purpose.
Yeah, but I think it's good to sort of analyze why everybody's successful and why you shop at one thing and not another, and try to think, have I got enough of a difference that I'm going to create a clientele and keep a clientele and develop a new clientele? And if you can do something that's sort of visually interesting, which is obviously, we're in a very visual world with TikToks and Instagrams and stuff like that, your customers will do the talking for you. Like I'm talking about Colourful Standard, and you've probably never heard of it. Now you'll probably look it up, and the people say, Colourful Standard, that's interesting. And it's, that would be my advice, I guess. Do something.
I think that's such good advice. Thank you so much. And literally this morning, I walked past a shop window, and I was like, those are pretty ballerinas. I didn't need to look inside. I didn't need to, and bearing in mind this is in Gracia in Barcelona. This is, so the chances were, I don't know, but I just saw them and I was like, those are it. And to test myself, I went into the shop, and lo and behold, they were. So you really do live by what you have just shared with us, in terms of creating something that speaks for itself, and that is visually appealing, and that you've marked out that niche, price wise and everything. And so it is great advice. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you so much.
And yes, and I'm sure now everybody's going to run, just try and find a pair of gorgeous, pretty ballerinas. So thank you so much for sharing that with us, and hopefully we'll have you again another time.
I would love to. Thank you very much, and have a nice weekend.
Thank you.